This picture is very different than the Oval Office meeting that happened a little bit more than a year ago. You can see Donald Trump is very happy. His orange tie, not exactly the best selection. Who am I to judge the president's outfit? Flopping in the air as he gives a thumbs up and a big toothy grin as Zelensky, the comedy king of Ukraine, laughs to his left. This is at the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey, where they discussed a host of issues. But most shockingly, to people who have been following this for a long time like myself, Trump gave the Ukrainians permission to make Patriot interceptors in Ukraine itself, saying that essentially by giving them the ability to make the Patriot interceptors to defend Ukrainian cities within Ukraine, by giving them that contract that can be quite hard to get, the Ukrainians could no longer complain that they're not being given enough munitions.
So one of the things we're going to be talking about is we're going to give a license to you to make Patriots. That's pretty cool, right? This way you can't complain that we're not giving them enough. I say make them yourself. We haven't informed the company of that yet, but that'll work out all right. I'm sure they'll be thrilled. But they'll be able to do it. You'll be able to figure that out. Most countries couldn't do that. No. If I said that to most countries, they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. But this is a very ingenious group, and what I like about that, it's a defensive situation as opposed to an offensive. But I think one of the things you might want to be talking about is that. That's what I heard. Little birdie told me that.
This is interesting too, because at the same time, there's a report that came out that the CIA has essentially been working at the hip with the Ukrainians to help choose targets across Russia to bring upon the most pressure as possible on the Russian Federation. That they're essentially targeting Russian oil infrastructure in tandem with the CIA. The CIA isn't pulling the trigger. The CIA isn't saying you have to attack this, you have to attack that. But the CIA is helping them choose targets to have the most effectiveness. And mind you, this is also happening at the same time that the Ukrainians are targeting tankers and transport ships in the Sea of Azov with increasing frequency and releasing footage of it online all the time. Like the Sea of Azov is now essentially like a playground for for Ukrainian drones and like attacks on Russian naval vessels and ships coming into Russian ports. This is just one example of a SBU Sea Baby, which is not the only water drone available, but is the one that's the most well-known, mostly because of its name. There are others that essentially do the same ram and explosion strategy and like technology without all of the fancy guns and whistles, even a little cheaper. But the Sea Baby is the one that is known. And there was one day where the Ukrainians targeted over a dozen tankers. Now, if that statement from Ukrainian authorities is true, that would mean that they had targeted and damaged or destroyed more tankers in a single day than the entire history of the anti-ship missile for its entire existence. Now, whether it was one day that they broke that history or it was a few days, Ukrainian drone warfare on the Sea of Azov is becoming more and more frequent. We've seen the Russian Navy have to be pushed from the seaside of Odessa due to Ukrainian drone attacks and the sinking of the Moskva. We've seen them being pushed further and further away from the coastline as the Ukrainians slowly evolve their drone technology to the point where the Ukrainians were able to send drones to launch other drones, sea drones, to launch aerial drones off the coast of Crimea. And now we've seen these sea drones and other drones scale up in production enough that the Ukrainians feel comfortable going after the shipping containers, both due to the general trend of the war, American view of Ukrainian pressure on the Russian economy, and their capacity just frankly expanding. So that is quite something The situation is different right now. Ukraine is bombing Russia the most it has been bombed since the opening salvos of the Second World War. Russia right now is having its ships targeted more than it has for the entirety of this lifetime. Right, suffering more naval defeats than Russia has in its modern history. The Ukrainians are causing more economic damage to Russia than it has ever suffered since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the economic chaos of Yeltsin years in the 90s. And this is being physically imposed by Ukrainian strikes. The frequency of these strikes are continuing to increase. The payloads in these strikes have somewhat expanded, and the amount of economic damage done to the Russian war machine has only grown. We see fuel queues in the Russian Federation, and we see complete fuel restrictions in occupied territories as prices skyrocketed in occupied Mariupol, and the Russian army had to prioritize shipments of fuel to soldiers in Crimea over shipments of fuel to civilians, causing a mass displacement and a lot of cancels of tourism in the peninsula. When you look at all these facts, combined with the Russian slowdown of their advances, as they're claiming control of Konstantinivka that they don't have, and the general vibe is that the Russians are under pressure. That is the Russians feeling the pain of the long-range war. It is the Russians feeling the economic struggle and the economic pain right now. That it is the Russian public that is feeling the most shift against continuation of the war, with the majority of Russians supporting a quick end to the war, and Russians feeling the day-to-day effects of war. The war is returning to where it started. Where the bombs were launched from, the bombs are returning. Yin yang, circle of life. For where there is force and an action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And Russia is finding out that law of nature, that law of physics. It applies here just as it applies everywhere else. And so as the Russians are finding out what war is, Trump is viewing this quite differently. See, some people thought Trump was ideologically tied to the Russians. I don't think that's it. I think he likes a strong man. I think he likes being able to tell the press, screw you, and put their thumb on the scale. I think he likes being able to guarantee an election result from before the election happens, not having to worry about the voters choosing wrong. I think he likes these things. But I think the thing he hates more than all those things is a loser. And more importantly, that stink of losing being wiped off on him. Not only does he not like losers, since Donald Trump said he would end the war in 24 hours and has offered Vladimir Putin endless amounts of peace agreements, all he has gotten in response has been disrespect. Maybe not in a formal capacity, but in a good negotiating capacity, absolutely. The negotiations have stalled. They have gotten nowhere. The Russians continue to make ridiculous demands that even Trump himself said are ridiculous. And people like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, those who were leading the negotiation process that was supposed to last 24 hours, have lost not only the trust of the general public, not only the trust of the people involved, but I mean, they've lost the trust of even Fox News. I'm not kidding. Here is Kilmeade talking about Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner on Iran live on Fox.
And I also don't think that Witkoff and Kushner should be the ones doing this. They're business guys. They have not been effective in Ukraine, not been effective in Gaza. They have not been effective in this. They can't have three portfolios to begin with. We have a State Department for a reason. Marco Rubio, even Democrats admit, has been looked at as a genius internationally. He is the guy that most people would want, even if you gave truth serum to Democrats. He should take the lead on this because you can't do this like a business deal. You have to understand the history of the region and how distrustful the Iranians have been. They will only make a decision if they have no other choice.
Now, this is in relation, of course, to the ongoing war with Iran, but he mentions Ukraine as an example of their failure. And the fact that he says it so offhandedly, like, oh yeah, they failed in Ukraine. Is that something we accepted? I don't remember that conversation being had. I don't remember Trump coming out and said we failed in Ukraine. I don't remember that being something openly discussed by the MAGA movement or the White House. I mean, when I go to any Trump supporters and I say, where's the 24-hour peace deal? I get that kind of pained look. I get that kind of, well, yeah, but I never got an acceptance that, they just failed on every front to end the war. I mean, obviously they did. Anybody with eyes and ears could figure that out. You don't need a complicated data set to analyze the situation right in front of your eyes. But to see it not only acknowledged, but to acknowledge it as a side point, not to acknowledge it directly, to acknowledge it as a bygone conclusion that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, which we've been talking about over a year and a half on this show, are failed negotiators, that they're not succeeding when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and hell, it doesn't seem to be like they're succeeding when it comes to Iran either. So it seems that Trump's stalled talks that were supposed to last for 24 hours did not succeed. They did not work. And what we've said on this channel time and time and time again, which is, if you want to get a different result, you have to change the equation. If you put in 1 + 1 and expect to get something but 2 after doing it again and again and again and again, you're crazy. You're crazy and you're going to get nowhere. If you want to get 3, you have to change the equation to 2 + 1. If you want to get 4, you got to change the equation to 2 + 2. If you want endless war, you continue to enter in the same numbers, the same lack of action, the same diplomatic failures, the same stalling, the same business-like approach to negotiating with the Russians, or even a new one that's less informed than the old one. So they failed, and we acknowledge they failed. And so if the conclusion is, we're into it now, deep into it, they failed to bring about the end of the war, you have to change the equation to actually end the war, which seems to be where Trump is leaning more towards now in public statements and talking about the war. This Patriot delivery makes a lot more sense. It makes sense that he would want them to make the Patriots themselves because it avoids American aid. It avoids draining from American stockpiles, while also hopefully buttressing Ukraine's ability to defend its airspace, both from the physical attacks that undermine the war effort, the horrific attacks on civilians, and the bad look for Trump, since he said 24 hours, and it looks like the city he said he would end the violences and still getting bombed. In fact, not only is it getting bombed, it's getting bombed at a larger scale and more frequently than it was before Trump entered office. So not only did Trump fail to end the war, he failed to de-escalate the war. In fact, the war has escalated in his tenure. So it seems that he looks at the situation and he says it's untenable, and so it has to change. And the Patriot offer is just one part of it. The CIA has been coordinating with the Ukrainian forces in the strike campaign on Russian energy, giving them targets, not physical support, but targets. There is, of course, the Pearl program, allowing the Europeans to buy munitions on Ukraine's behalf, but that only goes so far as the United States is willing to sell the munition. So if they only sell a certain amount of shells, that's how many shells they get. If they only want to sell a certain amount of air defense systems, that's how many air defense systems they get. So that is another avenue that they've been able to provide support. But when it comes to large, sizable aid packages that would truly change the equation, we have seen no moves. When it comes to things like the Support Ukraine Act, which would have been at least one step in the right direction, we have seen no moves. Instead, we get this Patriot deal. Now, do not get me wrong. This Patriot deal is a good thing for the United States. It's a good thing for Europe. It's a good thing for Ukraine. And it is a good thing for the long-term deterrence potential of the Ukrainians and their ability to protect their own air defense systems, their own systems and their own cities. I think that's all fantastic. For them to be able to do that 3 years from now, for them to be able to do that when Trump is no longer president. See, a contract to make Patriots means that they now have permission to make a factory, or even better yet, they now have permission to plan making the factory. Maybe the Ukrainians, knowing that once they got permission, they'd have to race for it, maybe they've already planned out the factory and sketched it out, but they certainly haven't laid out the foundation. They certainly haven't built the walls. They certainly haven't built the ceiling. They certainly haven't hired the personnel, and they certainly haven't brought in the manufacturing equipment or the American expertise yet. Meaning they still have quite some time before they're going to have anything resembling an active production line, or that production line will be able to produce enough PAC-2 interceptors to take out cruise missiles and aircraft, but also enough PAC-3 interceptors to take out the main ballistic missile threat that Ukraine is most worried about. So this is something that can help down the line, but even when production starts, production will not be ramped up enough to fulfill all of Ukraine's air defense needs. So this is something that helps with the long term, if Trump sticks to his word, because we've seen Trump flip-flop on his word before. We've seen Trump go back on his word. We've seen Trump lie, and then so this all depends upon Trump being a stable factor, off of Trump deciding that after a long night phone call with Vladimir Putin where he's kicking his feet like a schoolgirl, that he isn't going to just go back on that and betray the Ukrainians. So this is all assuming that this promise for something in the future actually stays attended to. That still does not solve the here and now. That still does not solve the air defense gap for the next 2 to 3 years, and the following year where the Ukrainians are going to be slowly ramping up production, because it's not you build the factory, you hit the button, and now you produce 1,000 interceptors a day. Let me give you guys an idea of the rate of use and the amount of interceptors needed. Within the first 2 weeks of the air defense missions and associated with the war against Iran, 1,800 interceptors were fired. We produce like 300, 400 a year. Meaning that this is something going to take, at best, if you maximize production, we're talking about something that will take more than 3 years in order to refill 2 weeks of fighting. So that's American industry right now. We're talking about Ukrainian industry now. How long is it going to take to make the factory? Will the factory be targeted by bombing? How long is it going to take them to recruit the staff? How long will it take for the American personnel to impart the expertise? How long will it take them to get the internal machines? How long will it take them to secure the financing to get those machines that actually make the interceptors? How long will it take them to actually get these missiles, interceptor missiles, going off the factory line? And how long will it take them to have them going off the factory line in sufficient quantities to actually make up the difference for America falling behind in supporting Ukraine's air defense? It's not going to be by the end of this year, and it's not going to be by the end of next year. Meaning the Ukrainians have to find some way to close that gap. I saw that the Poles gave some old 1960s, 1970s era air defense systems over to the Ukrainians. That's still not going to be enough. The United States has to find a way to cover that gap if it wants to make decisions that benefit its own national security interests, the safety of the Ukrainians, and bringing about the war to its most rapid conclusion. But if that's what the United States should do, if the ceasefire with Iran is off and we have to protect American bases throughout the Middle East, whether it be in Syria, whether it be in Qatar, whether it be in Jordan, or whether it be elsewhere, or protect Israel itself, as we've used a lot, and I do mean a lot, of our interceptors in our stockpile in order to do, Well, that is going to further drain our supply. And then people like Pete Hegseth or the Undersecretary Elbridge Colby is going to come out and say, like they have before, that we simply do not have enough interceptors to go around. There will not be enough interceptors for Ukraine. And so we cannot use our resources, send interceptors over there. Those people need to solidly lose the argument. And there needs to be pressure from people like Marco Rubio, but outside the administration, from the public sphere, from the American public, from experts, from the TV class that Trump sees on Fox and Friends. There needs to be a general pressure for action. There needs to be a general pressure to do something and to get on what they see right now as the winning side. And that means not only advancing the sanctions legislation that Lindsey Graham talked about in Kiev today, saying that it seems that they got the okay from the Trump administration to advance that legislation, but it means giving them the means. It means Ukraine having the ability to knock out the ballistic missiles that could destroy this Patriot Pac 2, Pac 3 factory. Giving them a license to build a factory that will immediately blow up upon construction is not defense policy. It's giving the Russians a turkey shoot. So I hope and I pray that the American government finds some way to fill the gap between now and the time that the Ukrainians actually have a steady, not just one or two, but a steady flow of interceptors coming out of their factories in Western Ukraine. If not, then the Ukrainians are going to have to find some way to survive until then and to protect this new American-Ukrainian initiative.